approval by Governor Macquarie in 1811 on his first visit to Van Diemen's Land. He stayed overnight at New Norfolk and gave approval for the formal layout of the township. And with the movement of people exploring and settling in the upper reaches of the Derwent Valley, and the movement of convicts to construct and work on projects, inevitably there will be a number who were unfit to carry out their tasks, and they were left at New Norfolk, and gradually developed into a depot for invalid convicts. And by the mid 1820s, the colonial surgeon, Dr. Officer, requested that improved conditions through better accommodation be made. And finally in 1827, Governor Arthur gave approval for the construction of the barracks, which we have looked at today. They were under the control of Major Kelso, the Royal Engineers, and the colonial architect John Lee Archer, who was responsible for many other public buildings and churches in Van Diemen's Land. The construction of the barracks was completed by 1830, and inmates moved in, and including at this time also some from the free community who obviously had a psychiatric problem. Very quickly it was assessed that it would have to be expanded, and a section was built on at the back of the existing barracks. Unfortunately, they were demolished in the 1960s, and they were the foundation of the first psychiatric or asylum in Van Diemen's Land. New South Wales followed suit shortly afterwards. With the increase in population and also the number of convicts that were arriving in Van Diemen's Land, and the associated health problems, both physical and mental, they were being congregated more at New Norfolk at the depot, in spite of the fact that by 1830 Port Arthur had also been established and had its own asylum rounded in Pression Bay eventually. From the late 1830s, the hospital was expanded again along the existing site of Humphrey Street up to George Street. And the buildings housed both female and male residents. By 1846, the hospital was entirely devoted to as an asylum. It is noted that Bishop Wilson, the first Catholic bishop of Van Diemen's Land, paid a number of visits here, and he was appalled at the conditions of which a lot of the inmates were being kept, and requested the government on numerous occasions during his tenure to separate inmates of meek and mild disposition from those who were loud and dangerous. However, nothing had been done by the time he left Van Diemen's Land. There were considerable public complaints about the conditions being held at the hospital, and usually following these complaints there would be some building activity on site. In the mid-1880s there was considerable building which went on to the early 1990s, where the two-storey building with a most majestic clock tower was erected, and the building at the end of the site known as the Idiot Boys Cottage, that was Owood. A magnificent building that, as the viewer will note, that the portals would grace any public building in the city even today. Building continued right on up to the First World War, when the first attempt to make conditions for staff was improved, and the nurses' home was built. This remarkable building, for its the amount of woodwork, of scroll work on the verandas, and the exquisite brick chimneys, are very much a feature of this building. In 1927 it was expanded again and replicated the 1911 design. The 1920s saw considerable criticism of the hospital, and until the 1930s, again, even at the height of the Depression, a building program began in 1934 and continued up until 1940. This, of course, had a very good effect, that unemployment in New Norfolk itself would have been far less of a concern because of this building activity, and there would have been less people in the dole queues. Of course, public servants had to take a 10% cut in wages. That would have also affected staff at the hospital. In 1936, the hospital changed its name from the title of the Hospital for Mental Diseases to Lachlan Park Hospital, an attempt to associate it as a hospital rather than an asylum and an institution. Medical science was slowly coming to terms with those people who suffered psychiatric problems and imbecility, a term that is certainly not politically correct today. The first administration building was opened in 1940. The architect was also responsible for building the Ogilvy High School, and his style of design can be readily seen when comparing those two buildings. The war years, of course, no building went on. Conditions, of course, deteriorated and became very run down. And at the end of the war, there was the government of the day brought in a specialist from Victoria to assess the problems of the hospital. His recommendations were that it should be largely demolished and a new hospital built. In 1949, the Parliamentary Public Works prepared a plan for the government to replace the majority of the old buildings on the original site. It first began with the construction of the new boiler house. That was the commencement of a steam loop system for heating and hot water to all the wards on the new side as well as the old. Construction of new wards began in the mid-1950s, along with a lot of staff houses, division facing Hobart Road, and at the same time the demolition of a lot of the early colonial buildings on Willow Court. The clock tower, or K block, was demolished, but fortunately the barracks were retained, being the oldest building on the site. The medical superintendent's residence, which had belonged to the colonial secretary John Burnett on the opposite side of the avenue, was still retained as his medical superintendent's residence. That had been built in 1834. Building on the new hospital, or the East Hospital as it became known, and continued up until 1968 with the opening of the Social Centre. This was a large, modern, up-to-date theatre with a gymnasium attached, a large swimming pool, large staff dining room which could be used as a convention centre from time to time, a library as well. At the same time, at the completion of the social centre, the name of the hospital was changed to Royal Derwent Hospital, and it also took under its wing the former psychopathic home of Norfolk Rise. Following the next few years, the nursing school reached a very high pitch in its turnover and of staff for registration as psychiatric nurses, and the school did not close until 1992. By the mid-1970s, winds of change were starting to blow over the whole system on how patients in an institution were being managed and looked after. Those with an intellectual disability had been at this stage kept on the Willow Court side, and names were being changed, and in 1985 it became the Willow Court Training Centre, with a different approach to how people were being looked after, and with normalisation being one of the key words. But the hospital as a whole has been a reflection of how society has looked after the less fortunate members of our society who did not what was considered the norm. So therefore, those with minor intellectual disabilities were given greater freedoms. There was more an accent on re-education, the opening of sheltered workshops, and a lot of these people were moved back into the mainstream of society under the normalisation programs. They lived in group homes. Some returned to their earlier places of residence around the island, as it was a statewide institution. Gradually, on the Willow Court side, there were no further admissions except in very challenging cases. And this continued on until Willow Court closed down in October 2000. The same was occurring on the other side, the East Hospital of Royal Derwent, the psychiatric division, where it became a worldwide practice to close down asylums and institutions and move people back into more community-based care and activity. And finally, in early 2001, the Royal Derwent Hospital complex closed after 174 years of operation. The changes, of course, with normalisation and integration into community are still continuing to this day, with modifications on that program to fit people with those intellectual disability problems and psychiatric problems to fit into our society where possible. Of course, there are all those that with an extreme challenge to society that have to be contained for their own good as well as the good of the community. Those units are still retained in small measure at Norfolk Rise, and of course the secure unit, the Wilfred Lopez Centre over at Risdon. How we accept people with psychiatric problems and intellectual disability is an ongoing and ever-changing state. Society has certainly come a long way in accepting those people back into the mainstream of our day-to-day activities to what they did even 50 years ago.
People say in the early 1800s, what would be daily life? What would be a routine that somebody in the early 1800s would have had here? They called this home. What would their home be like? What would their day consist of?
It would have been a very much a regimented routine of arising early, cleaning the ward, breakfast, and then out to work. And when I say out to work, the hospital inmates who were able and physically able would have been cutting wood for the fires, because all heating was done by open fireplaces. The guards were fitted for safety reasons. There was the ablutions block to clean. The facilities for toileting would have been by the proverbial night cart. Yeah. These all had to be emptied and cleaned for servicing the next night. A lot of the patients who would have worked in the gardens producing vegetables, because the hospital at one stage produced the bulk of its own vegetables. It had its own piggery, it had its own dairy, and its own hatchery. So there were a large staff of residents who worked in those areas. and up until the fitting of the steam loop system for heating, the contracts for exceptionally large tonnages of wood that would have run into at least 1,000 tonnes a year to heat the wards, as well as the bakehouse and the kitchen. There was a steam plant, of course, for the laundry, and that also in 1900 provided the first electric lighting for the hospital, and later, a few years later, provided street lighting for part of the township. So that would have been a big saving because of the danger of fire from lamps and candles. Would have been an ever-pressing concern to the staff, and from the records we cannot find that there were any serious conflagrations where anyone was burnt. The only one that does come to mind was the barn that was burnt in 1938, I think it was, and unfortunately some of the draft horses lost it, were burnt to death.
Right. If we move into the mid-1900s, 1940, 1950, again, what was life there? So it was fairly self-sufficient and had to be in the 1800s. Was it still the same in the mid-40s, 1940, 1950s?
Yes, the large gardening crew that were maintained was still there. Of course, a lot of base stores had to be provided by the government that could not be produced on site, and the gardens, the vegetable gardens, didn't actually close until the mid-1970s.
Right.
And of course by that time the dairy had gone, and also the piggery. So the hospital had become an institution where no one actually did any hard physical work. Yes, there were patients who worked in the laundry more as a therapy. When Home New Norfolk had a peg factory, a lot of patients with intellectual disability packed all the pegs. It was for commercial sale, and it was a very large activity where the pegs were brought in bulk from the factory and then packed into packs of 24 wooden spring pegs. And that again lasted until the factory closed in 1974. So therapy was, to keep people occupied, was a very, very important factor. They even had a small metalworking wood shop where cans, dustbins, metal dustbins that is, could be manufactured. The other areas for therapy where people had capacity under the industrial therapy, woodwork area was made for all sorts of furniture. Even concrete paving blocks were made, so that, well, there were people who were fit enough and be able to have some form of useful education and activity. And this continued right up until the hospital closed.
When, in moving into the 70s and 80s and just prior to it closing, there was a real change, and there was a change in community attitudes too, and probably a little bit more acceptance. What was daily life then for, say, somebody with a mild intellectual disability?
Well, again, there was, by deed, there was a structured regime. The resident, once he or she arose, yes, they had to make their beds and do all one's personal ablutions, and then breakfast. And if they weren't going to a therapy unit, then they could have the freedom of the grounds. New Norfolk has been a very, very tolerant township because the hospital and the town had grown side by side. We had an understanding of those people who, because of their problems, and we accepted them. Some of them, yes, on their days would maybe do a bit of light shoplifting, but instead of calling the police, the shop owner would call the hospital that a patient had just removed so many bags of lollies or a pair of shoes, and they were collected and the goods were returned. No conviction was recorded or made for. That term of understanding, a lot of other communities, because of community integration, have had to come to terms with. They may not have found it as easy as we did.
Fair enough too. Now, I mean, originally the centres supported people with mental illness, people with intellectual disabilities. What other conditions in the very start were here that could be recognised in records? Dementia and things like that for people?
The terminology used for someone with intellectual disability was just an imbecile. Certainly not a very pleasant term in use today. And if you had a psychiatric one, you were a lunatic. A very, very old term, not used today, though they are still heard, but not in a clinical context. So terminology has changed to political correctness, if you like, as how society has trying to come to terms with those who are difficult to place. And that certainly speeded up from the 1970s.
Any personal stories that sort of typify what life was like?
Yes, it's been recorded. John Woodcock Graves, from who wrote that well-known English air, "Do you ken John Peel?" He was placed here briefly, which he didn't approve of very much. Anyhow, he managed to make his escape, and he duly advised the authorities that he was no longer incarcerated at New Norfolk in the Asylum, and other people who knew him well spoke of him as a person who was more suited to be on the outside and not inside.
Right.
Another interesting character from a somewhat later period was Thomas Gabriel Reid. Now, in 1998, there was a National Mental Health Congress held in Hobart, and part of it was an art exhibition in the old seaward. And during the afternoon tea, I happened to be standing next to a New Zealand representative, and I noticed that he came from Otago, and I said to him, we had an inmate here who discovered gold at Otago in 1870, Thomas Gabriel Reid. He said, "You're pulling my leg." I said, "No, he died about 1894 and he's buried over in North Circus Cemetery." He said, "Well, you wouldn't believe it, but I live at Gabriel's Gully." He said, "I've always wondered why it was called Gabriel's Gully, after Thomas Gabriel Reid."
It all links back.
Yes, and so the following day, the final day of the conference, one of his offsiders approached me and said, "Was it fair dinkum what you told my offsider yesterday and about Thomas Reid?" And I said, "Yes, it certainly is. And if you had time, his headstone may be seen over in North Circle Cemetery."
Right.
So again, mental illness is no respecter of one's status at all in one's life, and that is one of the sad aspects. There, but for the grace of God, go I. We may go back one step, where in looking at genealogy, when we had the council from Wicklow Town in Ireland visited here a few years ago, and we had the corporation of Wicklow Town plus the manager and the deputy manager of their history centre. The main reason the deputy manager wanted to make the trip because she had a relative who had been convicted at the assizes of Cork and shipped from Cork to Van Diemen's Land in the 1840s, and he had, as far as they could find out, died at a place called New Norfolk. We had done the research because we knew they were coming, and during the tour of the township I was able to say to Shawman, as we got out of the bus, this is where your relative resides, in this churchyard. I have never seen the look of wonderment come over a person's face. She stopped and said, I've travelled 12,000 miles and now my mind is at rest. I know where he is. So historically and socially, the hospital has had a very large impact on not only this township, but the whole of Tasmania. It's people from the north of the island will speak of it. New Norfolk, yes, that place of the asylum, because of the 170 odd years association. And it was not uncommon for parents to say, look, if you, to their children, if you misbehave, you'll end up down at New Norfolk. It sounds a terrible way to frighten a small child into behaviour that they could be sent to an asylum. But of course, in the context of social fabric of the times, if you didn't fit, or your behaviour, whether you're a female, if you're promiscuous, or your erratic behaviour as a male, was such that you could be committed to the hospital. And once you were committed, it was certainly no easy task, unless it could be clearly proven that you were fit to go back into mainstream society.
You say that some of the people who lived here are buried close by. Life and death was something that everyone comes, any community comes to grips with. Was there births here?
Yes, that would have been one of the cloudier issues of society of the day. Records, if they exist, would certainly not be easily accessed or found through illegitimacy, and illegitimacy would have been a case for incarceration at the hospital. And some of the early records will show this.
And some of the people, when they passed away, they were buried in the local area, or?
Yes, the Stephen Street churchyard, which opened in 1823, was the main burial ground for the hospital patients. The Roman Catholic cemetery did not open till a number of years later, and the denominational cemetery of North Circle did not open till 1883, where you had all the denominations had a section of that cemetery. There was also a Wesleyan cemetery in Richmond Street, apart from the churchyard out at Back River for the Methodist church, which was built in 1837.
Spirituality, when we think there's a lot of churches that were involved in the community of New Norfolk, were they involved here with the residents of Willow Court?
Yes, they were. If we go back in time, that one religious convictions in the 19th century were very firmly implanted and were part of the social fabric. The Reverend Robert Knotwood was one of the first preachers here for the Church of England, and he preached to the convicts also in part of his ministry, and visiting the hospital was part of the accepted program. Now I refer back to when Bishop Wilson visited the asylum and his comments. So religion did not stop at the door of the hospital. And when during the last building reprogram, the hospital had its own chapel, a non-denominational chapel on the East Hospital. Apart from those who regularly went out on a Sunday to the established churches in the town.
You mentioned also about the therapeutic centres. So was that part of when we started to go into the educational phase of supporting people with disabilities?
That's an interesting one, in as much that education for those with disabilities brought about the establishment of the special school within the hospital grounds, staffed by the education department for children, young children within the hospital and some from the community. They were, because of their learning difficulties and their habits of distraction, and that they could not be placed within some of the other schools within the educational system in Hobart. But basically the special school did attempt to provide children with learning difficulties an essence of start of education to read and write and understand. We had a speech therapist, Muriel Knight, who unusually, near 80 years of age, was still employed in the public service. A most remarkable lady.
Oh, yes.
And again, she assisted those children, particularly with autism, and she had a great rapport. A most remarkable lady.
Okay. So autism, when was this sort of separated and sort of looked at as an issue and maybe recognised as quite a separate?
That, unfortunately, I can't give you any detail about that because I know there were some autistic children here which she dealt with, but as a separate area of understanding, no, I don't have that information. Talk about peculiarities of not only the inmates, there was a medical superintendent here, Dr. McFarlane, and he died about 1915 in office, and one of my now long gone relatives, as a small boy, used to visit with his father on social occasions, and Dr. McFarlane would say, well, would you like to accompany me, Mr. Nicholson, on, I have a couple of wards to visit. And he had the most peculiar habit of when he approached a door that he would take the tail off his long black coat, take it in one hand and very theatrically open the door with the covering of his coat toe. And my cousin was only about 9 years of age at the time. He said he never forgot, why did he do that? So there may be some link of those who were trying to treat those with a mental illness that it may be catching. However, but in all seriousness, those people who lived here for many, many years, it was their home. And in the last few years prior to closure, that when they were being moved out into, a lot of cases, back to where they came from around the island, that the community integration program, that a lot of them were very, very sad to leave this place, regimented as it may be, that it was their home, and they cried. Some were moved back to New Norfolk because they'd spent all their time here, and they worked with the staff, one in particular on the transport section. He travelled all day around in the bus, and that was his routine. Get up, have breakfast, and then join the transport drivers for the day's work. Delivering the mail, going collecting the mail bag from the main administration, taking it up to the post office. And so these habits, through the downsizing of the hospital, that had been for many, many years, were no longer there. So they were very, very sad to go. And they made their feelings known. They were human beings.
And there were a few people that, when they were moved out further afield than New Norfolk, actually chose to come back and live within the community of New Norfolk.
Yeah, very much so. They missed it so much that they were moved back here. In fact, there are still a couple of residents who regularly come down through the old hospital grounds as part of reflection of the past. So they are still a tangible contact with Asylum that from 1830 up until the year 2001.